And
Welcome to the Psychology Podcast, where we give you insights into the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity. I'm Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and in each episode I have a conversation with a guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a greater understanding of yourself, others, and the world we live in. Hopefully we'll also provide a glimpse into human possibility. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. Today we have Dr. Yoel Inzlicht on the podcast. Dr. Inzlicht is a Research Excellence Faculty Scholar at the University of Toronto. His primary appointment is as professor in the Department of Psychology, but he is also cross-appointed as professor at the Roman School of Management and a research fellow at the Behavioral Economics and Action Group. Yoel conducts research that sits at the boundaries of social psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience. Along with Yoel Inbar, he hosts the podcast Two Psychologists, Four Beers. Yoel, I'm really excited to chat with you today.
yeah, well, I'm excited as well. Thank you for having me on.
I really like your podcast. I'm a fan of your podcast and love all these sort of topics you cover on there, as well as the very informal, sort of chatty kind of feel of it, you know? And so I know the age of the replication crisis, but let's replicate that sort of feel
Okay, sure.
on this podcast and see if the replication holds and works in a different context. Sorry, I'm so
That would be
nerdy, aren't I?
wonderful.
I'm so nerdy. That was such a nerdy joke, wasn't it?
It's a pretty good one, though. One thing that really helps with the fluidity of our podcast is ours is a beer-themed podcast. So we're drinking beers, sometimes more than two. So that helps with the banter. It's more in the morning here. I don't drink beer. I make a rule not to drink beer before noon. So I'm strictly coffee this morning.
Yeah, I'm on coffee right now as well. But, it's an interesting idea for me to try that someday on the podcast. I can't have beer because of my dietary restrictions, but wine sounds good.
Just straight shots of Jack Daniel. That's what we did for our last episode.
Oh, boy. Well, maybe I'll try that sometime. I think it depends on the guest.
That's right.
And how much we can riff. Well, I already know that we can riff and, we can really just let this conversation unfold. I really don't have a strong structure for this. I have some potential topics. I thought we could start out with the most obvious kind of elephant in the corner, which is the replication crisis, because you've been on the forefront of this topic. You were on the forefront of this topic before, not to stroke your ego at all, but before the phrase replication crisis was a thing. I feel like you were standing up. You were saying look, everyone, we need to take a step back and look to see if our biases are creeping into this. Is that right? Would you admit that? I'm not saying you're the only one. But
Yeah. You know what? I'm not sure I'm one of the early adopters, but I think because it's kind of weird to think of myself as more senior. I'm 46 years old, but I suppose I've been around for 20 years now doing this. So I think there are a handful of more senior people who've been standing up and saying, "Hey guys, let's slow down and let's rethink what we've been doing, and also ask ourselves some serious questions. Have we made errors? Have we made mistakes?" And I think that's really hard to do when you're a bit more senior, because you've got something on the line now. I think so. In other words, I think it's easy to point the finger at bad science when it's not your own science, when it's someone else who's doing the science. I think it's a lot harder when you've got some experience under your belt to say, hey, we made mistakes. And when I say we, I'm also talking about myself. And I think perhaps I was one of the earlier ones to do that, to look at myself in the mirror. And I did that on purpose. I did that, I pointed the finger at myself and blamed myself for some of the mess that we're in, because at least before I kind of waded in, I'd seen a lot of people pointing fingers at other people, saying, hey, right, you over there, sure, you're doing something wrong. And, invariably what happened then was people got their backs up, people got defensive. And I thought it would be perhaps more productive. It'd be a way forward if I didn't blame anybody else except for myself and say, listen, I've contributed to the mess and I'm responsible partly for this mess, and I've got to clean things up.
Well, what was particularly remarkable and shocking, because most of us had never seen anyone do that before, was this this article you wrote kind of denouncing your work on stereotype threat. And it wasn't just you. I mean, you had colleagues, you had collaborators on that project. You potentially could have taken heat from your collaborators who didn't say that. Now, did you get any heat, a back channel for that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think sometimes I don't think things through. I mean, I knew I was taking a risk, and I knew I was, I guess, potentially biting the hand that fed me. So in this blog post that you're referring to, I actually was pointing at really two areas of work that I engaged in. So one area, as you mentioned, stereotype threat, but really that was a secondary player in that blog post. The bigger player was this work I'd done on ego depletion and self-control. And that had been kind of more prominently in the spotlight with regards to having replication problems. Mm-hmm. And stereotype threat, there have been whispers. And if you're paying attention, it's more than whispers. You're seeing people even screaming about it. Mm. And yeah, I was worried about it because I was worried about, suggesting there might be problems with stereotype threat because, again, I mean, these are personal friends. These are mentors. These are people who, there's not a doubt in my mind that without their help, without their support, financial and otherwise, I would not be here today. So to suggest that some of that work might not be as solid, I mean, it was disloyal of me. And I struggled with whether I should even point the finger at stereotype threat because, I'm indebted to some of these people. And I'm thinking most closely about my postdoc supervisor, Josh Aronson, who was, nothing but amazing to me, and also just a mensch of a person, a great person.
Yeah, he's a friend of mine as well.
Yeah. So I'm worried about it, and I know that he was a bit upset with me after that blog post. I know he wished that I had spoken to him about it before I had published it, but. I'm in this weird position, like I'm a human being, I'm a friend, I'm loyal to the people who I consider my friends and mentors. But at the same time, I've got this other cap, which is a scientist. And as a scientist, I think my job is foremost to, speak about truth, just small t truth, as I see it, speak about, the lay of the land as I see it. And what I saw and still see are problems. I saw problems with stereotype threat. It's not specific to stereotype threat. I think there are problems writ large in the field, but I know what I know, and I know stereotype threat, and I think there are problems. Now, I don't think the problems in stereotype threat are as mature as let's say in other areas, and that's because we haven't had this big, massive replication attempt yet. But I think that's on the way, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, thanks for your honesty about that. You point to a good issue that I wanted to discuss with you. I mean, the social human aspect of science sometimes cannot be removed from the criticism aspect of. I mean, some people do remove it and they come across as assholes, but if you're a human and you don't want to come across as an asshole, but you want to be productive and move the field forward, it sometimes puts scientists in a tough position if they have deep respect for humanity and the fellow scientists who put in such hard work. I think science is so freaking hard. Like, people don't really I mean, the people who, like, in the public who aren't scientists, who write these headlines like, this study proves this, what, I mean, I don't think they really fully understand just how, like, hard it is to, you can go through years and years collecting data from like 60 participants if it's like a longitudinal, like really detailed, like say a diary study or something. And then, like, if it doesn't replicate, it's fair to like talk about, I mean, we want to talk objectively about this, but at the same time, we don't want to devalue the real humanity of that researcher who, and I'm assuming good intentions, I'm assuming there wasn't data fabricated. I'm saying it just didn't work out scientifically. Fabrication is a whole different issue, right? But, just the human side of like an earnest attempt to get at the truth about something, and let's say it doesn't replicate or whatnot, and then the media kind of makes it is mean sometimes about it, like, like almost with glee, and some, like with glee, like, look, this didn't work out, like, isn't that exciting in a way? But let's not forget that, like, that person really put in blood, sweat, and tears into that,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your assessment. I think sometimes the human side gets lost. I think you were right to bracket out fraud. I mean, I think fraud is incredibly serious and important, but in my estimation, it's probably a small problem. It's still real. Yeah, it's real, but I suspect it's small. But I think, the replication issues are not in that arena of fraud. For the most part, I believe they're in the arena of researchers trying their best to conduct good science. And I think, making mistakes. And I think right we're experiencing now is a massive field correction where we're realizing en masse as a group we might have been playing a bit loose and fast with our inferential tools, and also maybe we didn't have as deep of an understanding of the limits of our inferential tools. And I'm talking here about stats, but nonetheless I think people have, for the most part, researchers do have the best of intentions. They're trying to do good work. I honestly believe that, and because of that I think you have to give researchers the benefit of the doubt. Now that doesn't mean if mistakes are found, if there are errors, intentional or not, it doesn't mean we can't call those out. But I think it's important to when you do call them out, remember there's a human being on the other side, and try to not infer motives, try not to infer, something beyond what you can't see. Talk about what you can see, which is the data and the inferences that are being made. And I think if you stick to that, and again, realizing there's a human on the other side, I think you're a bit safer. And I still think we're going to have this correction going on, but we're less likely to be assholes, as you said. But that being said, even if you are kind and polite and realize there's a human on the other side, I still think that we have a really tough time as humans, as scientists, dealing with criticism. So even if someone critiques you gently and kindly and politely, I still think that sometimes we overreact, and sometimes we personalize criticism that's not personal. And that's because we are so invested in our own science. We're so invested in our work that we can't help but feel personally attacked. So I have no doubt that sometimes people have felt personally attacked, maybe even felt bullied, when that hasn't necessarily been the intention or hasn't even necessarily happened. So I think we had to grow a thicker skin as scientists as well. So yes, we need to be polite, but we also have to realize, hey, we're all trying to seek out truth here. And if we get it wrong, it's actually better for the collective enterprise if someone tells us that we're wrong. And we need to have a thicker skin about it.
Yeah, for some people listening to that who may have gone through it might disagree or even be offended by you saying thicker skin. I'm trying to think about it from every perspective in the world right now, like you can imagine, like I saw this feature piece on Amy Cuddy, right? And it was like, and it was painted as like a gender thing, like really dominant males bullying the female scientist. And, like, do you think that does happen in certain instances? Like, is it possible in certain instances some people are seeing it that way, but it's not actually the truth? We're truth seekers. So what do you think the truth is?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few issues there. So if I want to hone in, I mean, I hate picking on Amy. So I know Amy personally, and I know she's gone through a hard time.
So that is legit. There is legit bullying.
Well, no, let's unpack a little bit.
Okay.
So I know for sure that Amy is going through a hard time. I know she's personally experiencing distress and anxiety, right. and she certainly experiences bullying. But then then we have to ask, okay, but what, she might experience that, but was there actually bullying? From my perspective, if we count bullying as piling on, persistent and consistent criticism, I think for sure. I mean, I think, someone, Andrew Gelman, for example, someone who's, I believe just down the street from where you are.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So I think he named her, I don't know, hundreds of times in a blog post, and maybe any one mention wasn't bad, but it's just like the persistent and consistent. So right. Yeah, that might be kind of piling on, and one could construe that as bullying. I do think that's possible.
And how do you see it along gender lines? Have you noticed or witnessed that at all?
So, I mean, first of all, I've heard the claim that there's some of the critiques are more likely to be leveled against women, and maybe especially more junior women. It's tough for me to say. I don't have any data in front of me. It seems to me like, clearly Amy is a prominent woman who's been critiqued, but I've also seen lots of prominent men who've been critiqued. So Roy Baumeister, he's been savagely critiqued. John Barge, I know he does care. I know he's been deeply affected.
Yes, he does care. That's true.
Yeah, but by the critiques, and he's also been, again, critiqued. There's been a lot of people, Brian Wansink. So I don't know. I mean, I would want to see data before I make claims of there's being a gendered element. I recognize that this is possible, and I recognize that people have made this claim. I just don't know how the data behind it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I want to see the data, and that can get you in trouble sometimes. Some people want you to take a certain stance on something, a very hot political issue or a hot ideological issue. And if you're the type of person who responds to questions like you just responded, that doesn't make you friends with everyone. It can actually make you friends with no one, in a sense.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess to
it must
some
be hard
extent,
sometimes to say like, look, I'd rather wait to see what the bigger picture looks like. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there are times when you don't need to wait because it's clear already. The evidence is already out there. So, for example, like last week or 2 weeks ago, I saw some, without mentioning any names, this is in the political arena, not in the science arena, another controversial thing happened in the US, which seems to happen every week now. And someone said, hey, hold on, the progressive element here, maybe it's not what you think, maybe it's something else. So actually, this is like, I can give the example here. This is like, when all those pipe bombs were being sent last week. Yeah. And I saw some more centrist, quote unquote centrist people saying, hey, it's possible this is not, some right-wing nationalist doing this. It could be a false flag attack. And I'm like, really? Like, think of the priors of that. It's possible this is happening. I'm not going to deny this is not possible, but
it's
the
priors
are. Yeah, it's just not probable. So I'm going to draw my conclusion based on my priors here. I think we can have these priors, but again, with the case of the gendered nature of these attacks, the evidence I see is like it seems like prominent men and women are being attacked. And for me, I don't see the gendered element, but I don't deny that's possible.
Or even the gendered aspect of the style of the criticism. Like, I mean, there are gender differences in antagonism as a personality trait, agreeableness versus agreeableness. I mean, women on average tend to score higher on agreeableness, right? So I wonder if sometimes that plays a more nuanced role in communication, science communication between genders. What I'm trying to talk to you about here is, but I'm trying to bring in the human side of it, of science, and just illustrate in this conversation how it's hard to separate like science from the human response.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's so many factors that go into the response. I mean, factors that go into the response, being criticized and what's your response to it, but also there are factors that go into the act of criticizing. And you mentioned agreeableness or lack of agreeableness, and on average, women tend to be tend to be more agreeable than men. And I think you might see that being played out on who is more likely to be a critic. So again, I don't have to see more data, but I believe my impression is that men are more vocal critics online, it seems like, and they're more likely to be, levying these critiques and maybe also levying them sometimes in less polite tones, I believe. But that's a slightly different question than, so that's gendered maybe in the side of the critiquer,
right,
of the critic.
And yes, for sure.
Yeah, but I'm less sure about the side of the target.
Yeah. And I was just talking about the critiquer. I was specifically talking about the critiquer and then within critiquers, it's interesting to think like, can we ever become really good at distinguishing like an academic bully versus a well-intentioned critique? Like James Coyne has been getting a lot of blowback finally, for his manner of discourse.
Rightfully.
And I do think rightfully, absolutely. That's why I said finally, it's like you go that many years being an academic bully, it's going to catch up to you, right? But can't you sort of tell as well, like the difference? Like I feel like there's a certain style and tone that seems like, oh, that's a reasonable critique. If the other person's offended, well, that's more their problem because they took it personally. But I can tell when something's a pretty reasonable critique versus being an academic bully. Do you have a good barometer for that as well?
I mean, I have my own barometer, and I think I suspect mine is probably consistent with yours. So there are a handful of people who I've seen, engage in criticism. James Coyne would be one of them, where I'm like, this is off bound. This has crossed a line or multiple lines. I think there's maybe a handful of people like that. So yeah, I mean, I certainly see them, and I react negatively to them. When I first joined Twitter, I was, let's say, if there are two camps, it's kind of silly to think of camps, but I was maybe more on camp status quo, like, oh, I think, we got some problems here. That might not be as deep as some people claim. So I was kind of more defending, and I was really reacting negatively against people who I thought were criticizing, impolitely or just being assholes, essentially.
Yeah.
But as I've kind of seen more the response of people who are denying the problems, I started to be like, no, I think the problems are deeper than people are saying, because like, why is there this reluctance to say, hey, there are problems here? And also the evidence, every week it seemed, it's calmed down now quite a bit, but a few years ago, every week it seemed like another big paper wasn't being replicated. Multiple lab things weren't working out. Statistical analysis suggesting this is bad. So it's just like, wow, okay, like how can you maintain your opinion of the status quo.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
also it seems particularly in social psychology though. Like I wouldn't say in my field of personality psychology, like it's like, oh, we didn't replicate the big five. Like if you have very, very large samples and you have reliable and valid psychometric tests, I find less of a replication crisis. It might be more of the ephemeral nature of social psychology experiments that make it more prone to replicate. I don't know. I'm just putting that forward. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of reasons, but yeah, personalities, I believe in a lot better place. I think for multiple reasons, the bigger samples, also working, if you mentioned the big five, so working in a strong tradition where everyone's kind of working on similar, or not everyone, but a lot of people are working on similar problems, where it seems like psychology is plagued by small samples. It's also plagued by bad theory or lack of theory. So, hey, I got an idea, let's try this. And then you try it and you try it maybe 10 times and you publish the 2 that work or something like that. So I just think, there are multiple reasons, but I don't think it's only social psychology. I think any field that relies, doesn't necessarily have a strong theoretical basis, has small samples, that relies on between subject analysis, especially, and that's, largely problematic. But, so I think developmental psych might be problematic. I think clinical psych is most certainly problematic. And within psychology, then you can talk about other areas outside of psychology.
Cool.
That have problems too.
Hey everyone, just wanted to take this moment to thank you all for your support of the podcast over the years. It's been a real privilege to do this podcast for you all for the past 4 years. If you'd like to further support the podcast, I wanted to let you know a few things you could do to help make this podcast a better experience for you all. First, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the Psychology Podcast on iTunes. This would help make the show more prominent on iTunes and increase our listenership. I believe you can subscribe both on your iPhone and on your computer. Second, it'd be great if you could give the show a rating and review on iTunes. I definitely read all the reviews, and they are helpful to others who are thinking about giving the show a listen. Another thing you can do, which is new, is to become a patron of the show by going to www.patreon.com/psychpodcast. That's www.patreon.com/psychpodcast. There are various options that you can select, which include the ability to ask your own questions to a guest on the show and to have a 30-minute Skype session with me. Thanks again for your incredible support of the show over the years. I do this show for you all because I truly love sharing my enthusiasm and love of the mind, brain, and creativity, and I really appreciate you joining me on this journey. Okay, now back to the show. Cool, so I've really been enjoying reading your recent research in preparation for this interview, and I thought for the rest of our chat today we could talk about some of your most recent findings. Let's talk about self-control is the one most closely linked to what we've just been discussing, which is the replication crisis. Can you tell me, you wrote this paper called Is Ego Depletion Real? An Analysis of Arguments. Can you kind of summarize some conclusions you came to from that article?
Yeah, that's so this is a paper that's in press now. The first author is Malte Friese, and really the main mover and shaker of that paper. But I've contributed a lot to it as well. That's why I'm an author. But essentially, I think the idea behind this paper is we wanted to take what appeared to be a really heated debate that was happening largely online. It was happening largely on social media, with academics, really arguing and debating back and forth with one another, but also, commenting on trends and recent publications. What is the state of the field of ego depletion? So, kind of to give a little background, ego depletion, the idea of ego depletion is an idea put forward by Roy Baumeister and a number of his students back in, let's say, mid to late the 1990s. Where they proposed this phenomenon of ego depletion. Ego depletion is the phenomenon whereby you essentially feel tired. You've engaged in some sort of cognitive effort, and because you've engaged in cognitive effort at time 1, you have less of it at time 2. So it relies on a couple of central ideas. The first is that self-control is a central resource, that many, many different things that appear different on the surface actually, beneath its surface, rely on controlled processing. So, for example, eating healthy. If you're, trying to restrict your food intake, that would require self-control. If you're trying to get yourself to the gym, that requires self-control. If you're trying to study for a test, that might require self-control as well. They all are kind of different skills or different behaviors that they all might require this kind of effortful deliberation, maybe pushing back certain predispositions or desires for the sake of some long-term goal. So that's, proposition number 1. Proposition number 2, and the central one, is that this self-control relies on a limited resource. So not only is it central, but it's limited, and it runs out. So much like fuel that runs your car, you've got this self-control fuel that powers your brain, your mind, And when you use it, you lose it. If you use it to control your impulse for something at time 1, you'll have less of it at time 2. And anyway, so the central goal of this paper was to say, hey, like, what is the evidence in favor of the existence of this phenomena, this notion that we are fatigable, and when we are, our behavior is affected afterwards. So what's the evidence in favor of it, and what's the evidence suggesting otherwise? And we went through a long series of arguments in favor, a long series of arguments not in favor. And I mean, the really short conclusion is that despite this being studied now for 20 years, despite the counts are vary, but anywhere between 400 and 600 separate empirical studies of the ego depletion phenomena, despite having these 600 or so studies, and despite there being 20 years of research and lots of theorizing, despite it capturing the imagination of multiple fields, despite bestsellers being written about it, it's not clear whether the phenomenon is real.
Ruh-roh! That was my Scooby-Doo. Ruh-roh!
Yeah. So now, to be clear, we're not saying we have evidence that it's not real. Okay, at least our story. I should say,
like the existence of God. You're making the same argument. You're like, I'm not saying God doesn't exist, but I am kind of saying it's 99% probable he doesn't, or she doesn't.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as that.
Okay.
I would say it's more that it's inconclusive. So it's more like we cannot affirm the positive. We can't say here is the phenomenon, just because there's so many questionable pieces of evidence in there. So the existence of publication bias, the existence of p-hacking that we know that affects the published record, failures to replicate, massive failures to replicate. But also the evidence isn't so strong that it doesn't exist either, right? So we're like, hey, our conclusion is like, we're just not sure, which is damning as well. I mean, it's like, hey, after all this stuff, we just don't know. It's as if we're in square one, essentially.
Yikes. So let's say that the truth is that it isn't real. Let's think it through these implications. So what explains like the feeling that it's real? Like I certainly, after a taxing day of exerting lots of self-control, I feel exhausted for exerting any more self-control. It's like I'm much more susceptible, at least it seems to me, to eating the cookies,
Right. And that's a great question. And it's actually one that I think puzzles me as well. So, to kind of rephrase your question, it's like, how is it possible that all these studies cannot find positive evidence for something that we clearly know is true?
The qualia, I can tell you my qualia makes it true.
Right. So I think there's a couple of answers there. So the first answer is that, well, maybe we just haven't captured that phenomena in the lab. Okay. So the typical lab demonstration is you get people to work hard on some cognitive task for, I think the modal amount of time is about 5 minutes. Okay. So you work on something hard for 5 minutes, and then you kind of test your level of self-control after that 5-minute period. Okay. Well, guess what? Maybe 5 minutes is just not long enough. Maybe we wouldn't have escaped the savannah if we couldn't, think hard for 5 minutes. Maybe, the kind of experience you're talking about is hours.
All day long.
Maybe, all day long. Right. So there's I think a brilliant paper published a couple of years ago now in PNAS, so the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it showed, or it demonstrated, well, they could not find a depletion effect within an hour. They didn't find it within 2 hours, nor within 3. They found it emerged at about hour 4. So, which is kind of a crazy study. So they had people, and this is also an fMRI study. They had people in the lab. Yeah.
In the fMRI machine for 6 hours?
Yeah, I mean, periodic breaks here and there, but yeah, to pee, to eat. But they found deficits only emerging at hour 4, and then obviously getting a lot bigger at hour 6. But the first 4 hours, and I find that remarkable because I find that almost too long. I feel like after I give a 1-hour lecture, I feel like I'm drained, and I feel like I don't want to. I can't. I talk about it as post-talk blindness. I just can't think. I can't really answer questions very well after an hour of speaking.
Have they ever conducted any meta-analyses that looked at individual difference moderators? See if there's any robust sort of personality moderators there?
I think there are a number of studies that would include individual difference variables. I'm not sure if they included things like the Big Five, but they certainly include things that relate to conscientiousness, right? So trait self-control, there's a bunch of these trait self-control measures out there that all kind of are highly correlated with one another, and they all correlate with conscientiousness. But the problem is that There's no consistent evidence in one direction or the other for trait self-control. But the problem is that the lab paradigms are just not strong enough to evoke fatigue, is what I'm saying. So there's nothing to moderate is the problem. If you're, I remember I've seen a paper, quote unquote, depleted someone by having them do 20 incongruent Stroop trials. We're talking about a minute of just naming colors. I mean, yes, it's taxing in a really, really minor way, but that's not going to lead to downstream consequences. So
right, that's not the same thing as me downing, 500 cookies at once.
Right. Or restraining yourself.
Yeah, I should have said, I should have restrained, like having it in my face and restraining it. Yeah.
Yeah. I just think the lab paradigms were not strong enough. And, when people have gone and done stronger manipulations, they're more likely to find evidence consistent with the idea, but even then, there's just not enough of them. So there's nothing to moderate.
Yeah. And also, I don't know if you see this as big of a problem, but I see a really, really big problem with this kind of research. The fact that self-report measures of self-control are really not very small correlation with more performance-oriented measures of self-control, like the Stroop test that you just said. And I know you did a really cool Bayesian analysis of that, but was wondering if you could first of all discuss that paper a little bit and why a Bayesian analysis can add more perspective on that. And then also, let's talk through the implications of this finding for maybe why we're not finding the ego depletion effect in the methods we're currently using.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things in there. So in this paper that you mentioned, essentially we're examining the relationship, descriptively, the relationship between trait self-control as reported by individuals, so self-reports, and then supposedly behavioral measures of control. And what we found is essentially there's a zero association between those two.
I found that in my own research as well, yeah.
Yeah, and I was very surprised by this. Maybe I shouldn't have been, because other people have found this. Angela Duckworth conducted a meta-analysis that included, I forget how many studies on that specific question, but a decent number. And her estimate was, I think, closer to a correlation of 0.1, so pretty small, but still there. Whereas we found that estimate was closer to, I think, 0.03 or 0.04, depending on what metric you want to use, and also, more consistent with a null than with the alternative there being an association. So I was surprised because these two, at least in theory, should be getting at some of the same things, right? So people who, Roy Baumeister, for example, he defines self-control as a number of things, but the main driver was the ability to restrain dominant impulses, the ability to kind of suppress your prepotent tendency and to replace it with some other goal. So pushing away the food impulse, the eat the cookies impulse and eat the salad, and replace that with eat salad instead. And so that's what's supposedly being captured by, that's what the construct is supposed to measure. And then he came along and with June Tangney proposed this highly used self-control trait measure. And that's supposed to capture, those sorts of things as well. But then we have these behavioral indices. These are indices, looking at people's, reaction time in terms of how they perform on trials, on tasks that involve what we think involve more inhibition, more restraint, or less restraint. And these are I can get into what these things get at, but essentially people call them, they get at attentional control or inhibitory control. They're supposedly behavioral indices of that thing. So now we've got two measures. One's a self-report that, at least in part, is supposed to get at restraint. And then you got this behavioral measure that, again, is supposed to get at restraint. But then when you look at their association, we found they're zero. It's more consistent with zero than with not zero. And we used the Bayesian analysis allowed us to say something about its, how much it's like the null, the null distribution versus like an alternative distribution. In other words, we could affirm a null, which you can't necessarily do. You can do it sometimes, but with some extra kind of procedures. But typical frequentist statistics, you can't necessarily affirm a null. You can only reject the null hypothesis. You can't say, you can't affirm the null hypothesis. With Bayesian, you're more likely to get there. So that's why we use Bayesian essentially. We can say, what is this more like? Is this more like a null distribution or an alternative distribution? So that's what, and essentially we're saying, hey, looks like there's zero association. But the implications of that are kind of wild. They're like, well, hold on, wait 1 second here. You're telling me these two things that are supposed to be measuring the same thing are not? And, and this is maybe
which is the truth.
Yeah. So that's, what the real one is one, but also another one is like, the implication might be, Now, this is controversial a little bit because I think people are still arguing and debating about what the Stroop task actually measures, which is, that's been around for 50 years. We still don't fully have a resolved, answer about what it's actually measuring. But, I think there's consensus that it's getting at attentional control, maybe inhibitory control. So does that then mean that the self-report scale is not getting at that? It's not getting at the restraint aspect of control? And if so, then I think it offers interesting clues. And the reason it offers interesting clues is because those self-report scales are really, really important, right? They predict all kinds of things later in life. They seem to be more powerful than the behavioral measures in the sense of their predictive validity. They can predict things with far better fidelity than the behavioral measures can. But now it suggests, well, why? Why is, for example, trait conscientiousness or trait self-control predicting life outcomes, 20, 30 years later? Why is that doing that? And it might not be because those people who are high in trait self-control aren't necessarily restraining themselves. They might be doing something else to achieve the good life. So we know, for example, that, people high in trait self-control live better lives in almost every dimension. Trait conscientiousness, great trait to have. If you have children, you want them to be conscientious, right? So what's positive about conscientiousness or what's positive about trait self-control might not be that they have a better ability to restrain themselves. Instead, they might achieve those positive outcomes through different means. Okay?
This is so important, and you've set me off in 20 directions, but I want to say that I did this analysis, which personality traits or which character traits are most predictive of well-being. And I looked at, all these 24 character traits. And I found that if you do a rank order correlation of all these character strengths and their relative strength of prediction to a very robust measure of well-being in life, you find at the very, very bottom is prudence or self-restraint, and self-control. These things are actually the very bottom of the list in terms of what leads to a life well lived. Look, this is very paradoxical because on the one hand, so much of life really is self-control or self-regulation. And so that's why I think maybe an important distinction here is between self-control and self-regulation. And I like the way this distinction has been made by various researchers like Blair at NYU, Clancy Blair. Because, he wrote this paper saying, well, look, what's more important is that we have the capacity to inhibit it when we want to, but not that we consistently, reliably do it. And maybe that's an important distinction.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's very important, I think, distinguish between self-control, which I, again, would define as kind of this power to restrain yourself, versus other means to achieve your goals. So, for example, planning. Simply thinking about your goals in the future, that's a very effective way. Goal setting is a very effective way of meeting your goals. And you could goal set and not necessarily restrain yourself when you, for example, face temptations. And it turns out that it's the goal setting that's really critical, and the restraint might not be as critical. But now I have a question for you. I want to turn it around a bit on you. So this analysis that you just mentioned, where you rank ordered, what predicts the good life, you said that restraint was kind of at the bottom. Did you have other facets of conscientiousness? Do they rise more to the top, or am I completely off there?
No, this was using the VIA character strength survey, which is not the big five. So there's no like conscientiousness is not one of the 24, character strengths. But what I think is an interesting pattern of data is that the weakest correlation was judgment and prudence. And the top two were gratitude and love, and things like creativity, self-expression. Self-actualization is not the life of prudence, necessarily overall. So first of all, did I answer your question there? Because
I think you did. Although you're predicting well-being, so subjective well-being.
A very broad measure of well-being that included a composite of connection, meaning in life, purpose, health. Like a composite health well-being score. Yeah.
I see. Okay. So I'm typically, when I examine these things, I'm typically looking at more, well-being is certainly one of them, but I guess I'm more interested in more performance-based kinds of things. So, grades in school. Beautiful paper published in 2011 by Moffat examining, a life outcome of children who have been assessed in terms of their levels of self-control and then following them 20, 30, 40 years later. This is this New Zealand sample. and the done eating sample, and they find that those kids who were rated as having high self-control as kids were more likely to have money in the bank 20 years later. They're less likely to be in prison. They're more likely to be healthy. They're less likely to abuse drugs. So all the good stuff, they have. And then, of course, there's tons of research on, trait conscientiousness, looking at it longitudinally, cross-sectionally, finding all that, relates to, relationship satisfaction, likelihood of, being married, not being divorced, all that other stuff. So those are the kinds of things. And from my analysis, at least, it seems like conscientiousness would be extremely important. But again, maybe not the restraint side. Maybe more the situation selection, a planning, seeing things through.
That's a good point. These character strengths, like I said, none of them I think can be reduced to conscientiousness. There's some of them show correlations with various big five, and there are papers on that. But I think, conscientiousness is, Brent Roberts has done this beautiful job of mapping the hierarchical terrain of conscientiousness, and self-control is a lower level, like restraint is like a third in the hierarchy, and then you have more proactive aspects of conscientiousness. I suspect the more proactive elements are the ones that are most predictive of the good life, and like industriousness, and just like you said, goal setting. Well, goal setting seems to be a proactive element, right? Because you're taking control, you feel in control of your life. Like if you're constantly self-controlling, but you don't feel like you're in control of your life, I feel like that would lead to unhappiness.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think you got it exactly right there. Yeah. And Brent Roberts, by the way, is like one of my gods. I mean, I think he's like does the absolute best work in self-control, period. But yeah, and there's this really cool analysis by Denise DeRitter, and Will Hoffman has shown something a parallel finding, suggesting that those who are high in trait self-control, and you can replace trait self-control with trait conscientiousness because they're so highly correlated here, they actually, in the moment, are actually using less state self-control. So people high in trait self-control are not actually controlling themselves in the moment more. They're controlling themselves less.
That's so interesting.
Right. It's kind of a paradox. And that's because what we mean by state self-control is, this kind of willpower, like pushing things away. Those who have high trait self-control, it seems like they're designing their lives such that they face fewer temptations to begin with, and therefore don't need self-control. And what happens when they actually face temptations is actually they do worse. But they just have set up their lives so they don't have that many temptations to begin with.
They tie themselves to the mast more.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I love that. Cool. So we could talk about self-control for eons, but let's move on to some of your recent research. You published a co-authored paper with Angela Duckworth recently, right? That I just saw.
Yeah, that's right. So that's hopefully one day published. It's a preprint now. It's a working paper. Yeah, it's a working paper.
What a cool paper.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that was a paper. Really, again, I feel like you're naming all these papers that like my brilliant collaborators have done most of the work for. So it's in this case, my brilliant former postdoc and now assistant professor at Carleton University. Her name is Marina Milievskaya, and Brian Gala,
who was Angela's postdoc.
Yes, that's right.
We were buddies at the same time at Penn.
Oh, cool.
His office was right across from mine. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
So was Angela's.
So,
yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So and I like Angela a lot. She's delightful and so energetic and
zesty.
So much. Yeah, so many ideas. It's wonderful. Yeah. So we had this one paper. Again, hopefully it will be a paper now. It's just a working paper, where we. So I'm a social psychologist, but I also have a cognitive psychology hat, and I'm really interested in effort and interested in what's called, it's been around, it's this law of least work. Psychology, you've got very, very few laws, but one of them is the law of least work. And that's this notion that organisms, as low as, crickets and grasshoppers up to humans, we show this pattern whereby if you give us a choice between earning the same, equivalent reward, but one requires more effort, one requires less effort. By effort, that could be physical effort. So the grasshopper has to hop 5 hops versus 1 hop, or the rat has got to go, 1 meter versus 10 meters, or the human has got to do 10 Stroop trials to think through something, or 1 Stroop trial to get the reward. Invariably, after you learn the contingency, all these animals will choose the less effortful thing. Okay, that makes sense. We're lazy.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's the lazy hypothesis.
Yeah, so we're lazy physically and mentally. So, I believe it was Susan Fiske and Shelley Taylor coined the term cognitive misers. So we tend to, given the option, we'd rather kind of save our cognitive resources. I can't believe I just used the term cognitive resources. I hate that term. By that I mean we just don't want to think things through. Sometimes we want to take the lazy approach. So that's a law, very robust.
You're lazy. That's so ironic. You were lazy to use that term.
The reason I hate that term is because I've got this,
I know why you hate it.
Yeah, I've got this paper where I'm kind of criticizing Roy Baumeister's resource model of self-control.
I know, you literally criticized that idea. No, I totally get why. It was funny, but I think you used it because I was the path of least, like it was most salient in your schema at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. It's exactly what I was lazy.
I know.
It's actually a word that kind of like it captures what we want to say, but I just also feel theoretically it's an empty word.
I know.
Yeah. So anyhow, so we have this, this law of least work, law of least effort. And but we thought, and this is really Marina and Brian's idea, that like there's more there. I mean, there are some people. I mean, clearly people are willing to work, and people are willing to think things through. We like some of us, for example, like to read really complex books, and we do that. We pay to read. We pay for the book. And some of us do Sudoku puzzles, which are essentially cognitive effort. Video games, yeah, there is rewards with video games, but it's also cognitively difficult. And in fact, the better you get at the game, the more difficult the game gets, and we like it more. Yeah. So we wondered if something as simple as like to what extent are you interested? To what extent are you intrinsically motivated for a task? That clearly is going to shape your willingness to engage effort in tasks. And that's essentially what we find. So it's not a crazy idea, but we essentially find that people who are interested in X, in our case, I believe we mostly looked at mathematics, and we found this in a lab setting, in a kind of a sterile lab setting. Those are my contributions, or Marina and mine contributions, or richer kind of field context in schools. This would be Brian and Angela's contributions, where they actually went into schools in inner city Philadelphia, I believe. And we find that, again, when we give students or participants an option between doing a hard math task or an easy math task, generally people will pick the easier one, or let's say in the school setting, we give them a math task or some attractive kind of, I believe it's a social media feed, or it could have been even a video game that was fed into them. And they could choose what they want to do. People will typically choose the easier one. But if you're interested in math, if you pick that more. So you pick the harder math items more. You pick math over your social media feed more. And what's interesting is not necessarily related to how good you are at it. So yes, if you're good at it, you will tend to do it more. But that's not a consistent effect. It's really about interest. But then I think the more interesting finding is that. The more interesting finding is that not only are you more likely to pick the thing if you are interested in it, you are less tired doing it. So even though you're doing the more difficult thing, the more demanding thing, you actually feel less tired than those people who don't like that. So if I like math and I do a bunch of math, I don't feel cognitively drained by doing that math. Someone does less math than me, but still does it occasionally, they feel more tired. So it speaks to the subjective nature of fatigue. So I think to some extent we think fatigue is like, it's a readout of how hard we've worked. And I think that's one input to feeling tired. But a separate input is, again, our subjective enjoyment of the task and how much we like it, how good we think we're at it, so on and so forth. So, actual feelings of fatigue are not purely based, it's not a direct output of how hard we've worked.
That's really cool research. Did you cite Paul OKeefe at all in that paper?
Ooh, I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm going to download the preprint right now and see if you did. So I just sent you, what I did is I sent you in your chat box a prior study done by OKeefe, finding very similar findings. He's a friend of mine. I know he's been really interested in this research, and he's not cited in that paper. And I actually think that is unfortunate.
There's still time. It's a working paper. We can still do it.
Good. Please do, because I know he was very excited to share his work with Angela about this. But and I wonder how much influenced it, because this paper found that those who had more interest in a task, when they then did like a hand grip task, like a traditional performance measure of self-control, they had more self-control. They had more, they put it in terms of resources, self-control resources. But even if that's not true, they demonstrated more performance self-control if they were more interested in a task before it. If they were uninterested, it taxed them more. And they did another study, showing that, just interest-fueled effortless engagement in tasks, like the subjective feeling of effort was much reduced, when you were interested in it. So I actually think that was a really seminal kind of prior study
Oh, we definitely dissect
Yeah.
that. I mean, that's
Yeah. Please
that's
do.
certainly,
Please do.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's essentially, I mean, very. I mean, I'm sure we got it in different ways, but
Yeah.
it sounds like we're saying the same thing.
Yeah. Cool. So I respect the fact that most of the studies I mentioned here are not, you're not like first author on, and I appreciate you bringing that up. So why don't we end here on boredom? Because I think that is a topic that you're more a lead on those studies. And you also say that you personally are the kind of person who gets bored easily. Is that right?
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
I am boredom prone. Yeah, I made this joke like a dozen times, but I'm going to make it again. I find boredom fascinating.
That's so funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of these things where, like, okay, let's go here and talk about boredom. I mean, is that going to be exciting or boring?
Well, I find daydreaming fascinating, if that's related at all.
It might be. I mean, I wonder. I suspect boredom would contribute to people daydreaming. It might be an input to people daydreaming. Yeah, so I think boredom is fascinating, and there are now not a lot of people studying this, but there are a number of people, actually more in cognitive psychology, who look at boredom, and I would say they look more at trait boredom. So people tend to be boredom prone more generally. There's interesting work, for example, showing that, I'm not sure if you knew this, I didn't know this until I learned about it, that a very, very common, and it might be one of the more common symptoms of suffering traumatic brain injury is feeling boredom, feeling and maybe related feelings of apathy. So it's kind of a persistent complaint of people who go, and they might recover. They'll recover eventually from the boredom, and some of them will recover from have full function. But the boredom is what's really, really aversive to them. So I find that interesting. But I'm more interested in state boredom. So being in a position where, you might be engaged in something, and then all of a sudden you're just, your engagement wanes. And why I'm interested in it is because part of me wonders if what we think of as fatigue or ego depletion might be more akin to boredom, or at least partly boredom. And that is so think of the typical ego depletion study. You have people come into a lab, do something laborious, difficult, effortful for, like I said, about 5 minutes. But those tasks are also typically not interesting, right? They're typically not meaningful for the participant. So doing a 5-10 minutes of a Stroop task, it might be interesting for the first minute or so, but then you get used to it, and then it's like, oh God, another, it's a mind-numbing task.
It's like IQ tests as well.
Yeah, that's right. So to some extent, I wonder if some of the after effects that, again, we might have seen with some of these depletion studies is simply like a means to regulate your boredom, right? So I'm doing this task. It's not meaningful. It's also really, really hard for me, or conversely, it's too easy for me. Both of those things. If something is meaningless and it's either beyond my capacities or way, way under my capacities, that will lead to boredom. And this is actually, I'm borrowing now from work done by this brilliant young a psychologist named Erin Westgate, who's, I believe, a postdoc now at Ohio State, worked with Timothy Wilson. And she has this brilliant paper. I think it's either in press or maybe already published in Psych Review, I believe, on state boredom. And she puts this model of boredom out there. And in essence, I simply think it might be contributing to a lot of the more phenomena than we might think. So, for example, here's a controversial one. It's possible that a lot of fMRI studies, long fMRI studies, you get people lying down, you get them doing these tasks. Are we just like are fMRI studies the study of disengaged participants? Right?
Can you ask that question one more time?
Yeah. So put yourself in this position. You're in this, you're lying down on a super noisy, maybe uncomfortable scanner, and maybe the first few minutes you're engaged. But after a while, it's like, Jesus, how many times are they going to ask me this kind of same question, or have me imagine doing this thing over and over again? After a while, you are bored. And I suspect your number one motivation in a study, not just from fMRI studies, but other studies too, is I want to get out of here. I want to be done, and I want to go eat lunch, or I want to go meet my friends. So you're kind of already in a low engagement state. So are many of those studies, kind of partially,
ceiling effect.
Or polluted by, boredom.
Yeah.
Is what I wonder.
Yeah, we're already at the ceiling of boredom there.
Yeah, that's right. And so what's interesting about boredom as well is that, so we talked about the antecedents of it, but the consequences of boredom are actually very similar to the consequences of fatigue. So when you're bored, just like when you're fatigued, so there are these functional theories of both those emotions. And, from what I've seen is that they both act as stop signals. They both act as like hey, stop what you're currently doing, scan the environment and do something else. In other words, the number one motivation when you're bored or tired is do something else. Now, sometimes we think fatigue, the only thing you want to do is sleep. That's not necessarily the case. That's sleepiness. Sometimes when you're fatigued, I know some people when they're tired, and this sounds weird, they want to go jogging. They want to exercise. Okay. When they're mentally drained, they want to go do exercise.
I know, yeah.
Which again shows you the subjective nature of fatigue. But what it's doing is saying, stop what you're currently doing. You've got other goals to maintain a happy and full and complete life. Go do those other goals now. And boredom might do the same thing. Boredom might essentially be like, I'm not engaged with this, and there are many other things I could be doing. I want to be doing that other thing right now.
Gosh, so interesting here. This linkage with the ego depletion is brilliant and kind of like takes us back to the beginning of this conversation. So many of these things are linked, and the linkage there to my own research is clear because I've been interested in distinguishing between mind wandering and productive daydreaming. Some people lump all daydreaming into the same category of like it's idleness, but that's not true. I mean, the default mode network is associated with compassion. It's associated with imagination, things that can be very productive, if we harness it with our executive attention network. So maybe a good reconciliation of a lot of this is not viewing the executive attention network in isolation from these other brain networks. If you want to take a neuroscience perspective, but say it really matters what we're pairing it with. Is it paired with rumination processes, or is it paired with positive imagination and a hopeful, construction simulation of your future self? That's the level of distinction I think we need to make these things. And some of those contents are going to be more boring than others.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's productive and not productive daydreaming or mind wandering. And I think fatigue and boredom both might lead to mind wandering, some of which might be productive. So much literally might be, okay, I'm in this boring study. I fulfilled my obligation to the experimenter, and I'm just kind of going to walk through this. I'm going to kind of sleepwalk through the rest of the study. And then that gives the appearance of me not having self-control, right? I'm now doing poorly on a Stroop task. I'm reaching for the cookies now because I'm thinking about something else. But it's not because I've lost self-control or necessarily even lost motivation. It's more that I'm like starting to engage with other tasks, like preparing for my class, or thinking about my class, or preparing for an assignment in my mind. And it's not necessarily loss of self-control at all. It could be a whole host of other things.
Cool. Well, hey, Michael, want to be respectful of your time. I just want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today. And I hope you found this chat just as interesting and unboring, non-boring, whatever the word is, the correct antonym there, as I did.
Yes, it was really, really exciting. Thank you for having me on. I did not find it boring whatsoever. Hopefully your viewers your listeners, I should say, will agree.
Hopefully, but they tend to be just as geeky as I am. So I think you'll get a still sizable proportion of our listeners who will be right on board with this.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Psychology Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com. That's thepsychologypodcast.com. Also, please add a rating and review of the Psychology Podcast on iTunes. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the podcast, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.